Welcome back to Sarah History. Today we are going to talk about something that was not a single road. It was not one path, not one route, not one invention of one person at one moment in time. It was something more like a living organism, a network of trails and desert crossings and mountain passes and sea lanes that grew organically over centuries, connecting the eastern edge of the world to the western edge, carrying silk and spices and gold and glass and paper and gunpowder and religion and plague and mathematics and music and ideas across the longest distances human beings had ever traded across. We are talking about the Silk Road. And I want to begin by dismantling a word, because the word itself is misleading. The Silk Road was not called the Silk Road by the people who traveled it. That name was invented by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. The people who actually walked those routes, rode those camels, sailed those seas, buried their dead in those deserts, they did not think of themselves as being on the Silk Road. They thought of themselves as merchants trying to make a profit, or pilgrims trying to reach a holy place, or soldiers following orders, or diplomats carrying letters between emperors who had never met and never would. The Silk Road is our name for their lives. And like most names we give to things that were too large and too complex to name cleanly, it simplifies something that deserves to be understood in its full, messy, extraordinary reality. So today, that is what we are going to do. We are going to walk the road. We are going to meet the people on it. We are going to understand what it actually carried. Not just silk, not just spices, but the deepest currents of human civilization moving between peoples who might otherwise have lived and died without ever knowing the other existed. And we are going to understand why the story of the Silk Road is really the story of the world. Part 1. Before the road, the world it connected. To understand what the Silk Road meant, you have to first understand how disconnected the ancient world was. In 200 BC, the Han dynasty of China was one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. It had a centralized government, a bureaucracy run on Confucian principles, a population of perhaps 60 million people, advanced agriculture, bronze and iron metallurgy, silk weaving technology that was the most refined textile production in the world, and a wall of earthwork fortifications stretching across its northern frontier. China knew very little about what lay to its west beyond the steppes. There were rumors, occasional goods that arrived through so many intermediary hands that their origin was mythology by the time they reached the Han court. In the Mediterranean, Rome was at the height of its republican power, soon to become an empire. Greek culture permeated the eastern Mediterranean and had, through Alexander's conquests a century before, reached as far as the borders of modern-day India. The Romans knew about a mysterious eastern land from which a fabric of impossible fineness came. They called it Serica, the land of silk. They did not know it was China. They thought silk grew on trees. They had no idea that it came from the cocoons of silkworms. The secret of silk production would be kept by China for nearly 1,000 years. Between China and Rome lay some of the most formidable geography on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name in Uyghur means something like you go in and you don't come out. The Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where passes reached altitudes of 4,000 meters and where altitude sickness, frostbite, and bandits were equal threats. The Iranian Plateau. The deserts of Persia and Arabia. The mountains of the Caucasus. These were not obstacles that most people crossed. Most people, in the ancient world, never traveled more than 50 kilometers from where they were born. And yet goods moved. Not quickly. Not safely. Not through any single organized network. But goods moved. Jade from China appeared in the markets of Central Asia. Roman glass turned up in Chinese tombs. Indian cotton reached Mediterranean ports. The movement was slow, indirect, conducted through chains of intermediaries, each merchant selling to the next, each caravan carrying goods one section of the route and selling them to the next caravan. No single trader in 200 BC traveled from Rome to China or vice versa. The journey would have taken years. The road was assembled from thousands of shorter journeys laid end to end. What changed this? What began the process of giving this network some coherence, some awareness of itself as a network, was a man named Zhang Qian. And his story is worth telling. Part 2. The Man Who Opened the Road. In 138 BC, the Han Emperor Wudi sent a diplomat named Zhang Qian westward into the unknown. The mission was not cultural. It was military. The Han were being harassed along their northern frontier by a confederation of nomadic tribes called the Xiongnu, a people related to or possibly the same as the later Huns who would terrify Rome. Wudi wanted to find other peoples to the west who were also enemies of the Xiongnu and propose a military alliance against them. Zhang Qian set out with a party of about 100 men. He was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately and held for 10 years. He married a Xiongnu woman. He had children. He waited. And eventually he escaped, continued westward, and reached the region of Fergana in modern Uzbekistan, a land of extraordinary horses, taller and more powerful than the small steppe ponies of Central Asia, horses that Chinese sources would later call the heavenly horses. He traveled further, reaching the Yuezhi people in what is now Afghanistan and making contact with their king. The military alliance he was sent to arrange never materialized. But Zhang Qian returned to China in 126 BC, 12 years after he left, with only 2 of his original 100 companions alive, carrying something more valuable than any treaty. He carried information. He told Emperor Wudi what lay to the west. He described the peoples, the lands, the goods, the trade possibilities. He described Fergana's heavenly horses, which Wudi became obsessed with. The Han would later fight a war specifically to obtain these horses. He described the routes. He described the possibilities. Wudi sent him again in 119 BC, this time westward toward the Wusun people. Zhang Qian sent sub-envoys in multiple directions, toward Parthia, toward India, toward Bactria. For the first time, the Han court had something resembling a map of the Western world. And for the first time, the Chinese state began actively encouraging and protecting trade along these Western routes. Zhang Qian did not build the Silk Road, but he opened China's eyes to its existence and its possibilities. He is remembered in Chinese history as the man who opened the road to the West. And the road, once opened in the consciousness of empire, began to function as something more than a trickle of goods through a chain of anonymous intermediaries. It became, slowly, a highway. Part 3. What the road actually carried. Silk. Yes. Silk above all else in the early centuries. Chinese silk was so valued in Rome that the Roman Senate, at various points, tried to ban its import, not because it was harmful, but because Romans were spending so much money on it that gold was flowing east at a rate that alarmed the treasury. Roman men wearing silk togas were considered to be dressed in something barely respectable, too sheer, too luxurious, too close to transparent. Roman women wearing it were considered scandalous. Everyone wanted it anyway. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, complained bitterly about the Roman appetite for Eastern luxury goods, calculating that India, Arabia, and China drained Rome of 100 million sesterces per year. He was appalled. The trade happened regardless. But silk was only the beginning. Spices from India and Southeast Asia, black pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, traveled west along the road and were worth fortunes in European markets where they were used to flavor food, to preserve meat, and as medicine. A pound of pepper was worth more than many workers earned in a month. The spice trade was the financial engine of the Silk Road for centuries. Chinese porcelain traveled west and became so prized in Persia and the Islamic world that Persian potters spent centuries trying to replicate it, and in doing so developed their own extraordinary ceramic traditions. Chinese lacquerware. Chinese bronze. Chinese iron. From west to east traveled glass. Rome and the eastern Mediterranean were the world's great glassmakers, and Chinese consumers prized Roman glass as highly as Romans prized Chinese silk. Woolen textiles from the Mediterranean, already dyed in vivid colors that Asian weavers could not yet produce. Gold and silver coins, Roman denarii, have been found in archaeological sites across Central Asia and India. Horses. Weapons. Amber from the Baltic, which traveled down through Europe into the Mediterranean and then east along the Silk Road into Persia and India. And then there were the things that are harder to weigh and measure but arguably more important than any physical commodity. Paper. Invented in China around the 1st century AD, paper traveled westward along the Silk Road. Arab merchants learned its manufacture in the 8th century after capturing Chinese papermakers in the Battle of Talas. The Arabs spread papermaking across the Islamic world. From there, it entered Europe in the medieval period. Without the Silk Road, Europe might have continued using expensive parchment made from animal skin for centuries longer. Paper was the prerequisite for the printing press. The printing press was the prerequisite for the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the spread of mass literacy. The entire intellectual history of early modern Europe runs through a technology that came from China via the Silk Road. Gunpowder. Invented in China in the 9th century by Taoist alchemists who were, with beautiful irony, trying to make an immortality potion. Gunpowder traveled west. By the 13th and 14th centuries it had reached the Islamic world and then Europe. The cannon, the musket, the rifle, the bomb. The entire history of modern warfare, the end of the castle, the end of the armored knight, the reshaping of every military force on earth, traces back through the Silk Road to a Chinese alchemist's failed attempt at eternal life. The compass, printing, stirrups, new crops and agricultural techniques. Musical instruments. The lute that became the central instrument of European medieval music traveled west from Central Asia. The game of chess, developed in India, traveled west through Persia to the Arab world and then to Europe. Mathematical concepts. The numerals we use today, the ones we call Arabic numerals, traveled from India through the Islamic world to Europe along routes that ran beside the Silk Road. The concept of zero, perhaps the most important single mathematical idea in history, made that same journey. The Silk Road did not just carry goods. It carried the operating system of civilization itself. Part 4. The cities that grew on the road. Every great trade route grows cities. The Silk Road grew some of the most extraordinary cities the medieval world ever produced. Samarkand. In modern Uzbekistan, at the crossroads of the eastern and western branches of the road. At its height under the Timurid dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries, Samarkand was one of the most magnificent cities on earth. Its Registan, the central public square, was ringed with mosques and madrasas tiled in the most intricate blue and turquoise and gold mosaic work ever created. Its observatory, built by the astronomer king Ulu Beg, produced star catalogues of extraordinary accuracy. It was a city where Persian poets, Turkish architects, Arab mathematicians, and Chinese traders all existed simultaneously, where the cultural output of 3 or 4 civilizations mixed and produced something new. Marco Polo passed through and described it as a very large and splendid city. Kashgar. In the Xinjiang region of China, at the point where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert converge and where the road begins its climb toward the Pamirs. Every caravan going east or west passed through Kashgar. Its bazaars were legendary, a place where you could buy goods from a dozen different civilizations in a single afternoon. It is still a city today and still has traces in its old quarter of the medieval trading city it once was. Dunhuang. In northwestern China, the last major Chinese city before the road entered the desert. The caves at Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves, contain the largest collection of Buddhist art in the world, painted over a period of roughly 1,000 years by merchants, pilgrims, and devotees who stopped here before or after crossing the Taklamakan. In a sealed chamber discovered in 1900, a monk had hidden roughly 40,000 manuscripts dating from the 5th to the 11th centuries, texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and other languages, covering Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, medicine, mathematics, poetry, and trade. The cave had been sealed for 900 years. It was one of the greatest manuscript discoveries in the history of archaeology. Baghdad. Founded in 762 AD by the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad was designed from the beginning to be the center of the world. The circular city, the round city, sat at the junction of major trade routes and became within a century the largest city on earth, with a population possibly exceeding 1 million people. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was the greatest library and translation center in the medieval world. Scholars there translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic, preserving and synthesizing the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations. Many of the Greek texts that Europe rediscovered during the Renaissance came through Arabic translations made in Baghdad. The city was the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. And then the Mongols came. In 1258, as we discussed in Episode 4, Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad and destroyed the House of Wisdom. The books thrown into the Tigris. The water running black with ink. It was one of the great catastrophes of the Silk Road era, the destruction of the city that had been the road's greatest intellectual node. Part 5. The People of the Road. Who actually traveled the Silk Road? The most important traders you have probably never heard of were the Sogdians. They lived in the region of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, in the cities of Samarkand and Bokhara, and for roughly 1,000 years, from about 300 AD to 1000 AD, they were the dominant merchants of the Central Silk Road. Sogdian merchants established colonies in China, in India, in Persia, in the Byzantine Empire. They were the great middlemen, the people who actually moved goods from one end of the road to the other. They spoke multiple languages. They had a written script that became the ancestor of several modern alphabets, including the scripts used for Mongolian and Manchu. They were remarkably well documented. A cache of their personal letters, dating to around 313 AD, was found in a watchtower on the Chinese frontier and gives us an intimate human picture of merchant life on the road. One letter is from a woman whose husband left her in Dunhuang and never returned, and who is writing to her mother to say she wishes she had never come to China. Buddhist monks. The Silk Road was one of the great highways of religious transmission. Buddhism originated in India and traveled east along the road into Central Asia and China. One of the most famous figures of this transmission was Xuanzang, a Chinese monk who in 629 AD, in defiance of an imperial ban on travel, slipped out of China and crossed the Taklamakan Desert, the Pamirs, and the Hindu Kush to reach India, study at the great Buddhist university at Nalanda, and returned 17 years later with over 600 Sanskrit texts. His journey became the basis for the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, one of the most beloved works of Chinese literature, the story of the Monkey King accompanying a monk on a journey full of monsters and magic. Behind the mythology was a real man, crossing a real desert, risking his real life for knowledge. Christian missionaries. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of Christianity that had been declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, traveled east along the Silk Road and established churches in Persia, Central Asia, and eventually China. A stone stele discovered in the former Tang dynasty capital of Xi'an records the existence of an Nestorian Christian church there in the 7th century. Islam traveled the road. Zoroastrianism traveled the road. Manichaeism. Judaism. Jewish merchant communities existed along the road from the Mediterranean to China for over 1,000 years. The Silk Road was possibly the most religiously diverse space in the ancient and medieval world. No single faith dominated it. Survival on the road required tolerance, or at least the pragmatic suspension of intolerance. And then there were the ordinary people. The camel drivers. The caravan guards. The innkeepers at the caravanserais, the roadside rest stations that the Persian and later Islamic empires built along the road to shelter travelers, typically a day's journey apart. The translators and interpreters. The water sellers. The bandits who preyed on the caravans and the soldiers who were sent to stop them. The women who worked in the inns. The slaves who were bought and sold along the route. The Silk Road was also a slave road, a fact that its romantic reputation tends to obscure. Millions of people were moved as human cargo along the same routes that carried silk and ideas and religion. The road was not romantic for the people on it. It was dangerous, exhausting, unpredictable, and often fatal. The Taklamakan claimed caravans whole. Bandits struck without warning. Water ran out. Mountain passes closed in sudden snowstorms. Disease was constant. The caravanserais were crowded, noisy, smelly, and full of people who did not share your language or your gods or your customs. And yet they went. Because the prophet was there. Because the faith called them. Because the emperor commanded. Because curiosity is a force that humans have never been able to fully suppress, no matter how formidable the desert. Part 6. The road's greatest traveler. We cannot tell the story of the Silk Road without Marco Polo. In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian boy named Marco Polo left Venice with his father Niccolò and his uncle Maffeo, who were experienced traders, and began a journey that would last 24 years and cover roughly 40,000 kilometers. They traveled east through Persia, through the Pamirs, through Central Asia, through the Gobi Desert, and arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China and grandson of Genghis Khan, in 1275. Marco stayed. For 17 years he served in the court of Kublai Khan, traveling on diplomatic missions to virtually every province of the Mongol Empire, which, at that point, encompassed China, much of Central Asia, and Persia. He saw things no European had ever seen. Cities larger than anything in Europe. Paper money. Europe still used coins. Coal used as fuel. Europe had not yet developed coal. The Grand Canal of China. The city of Hangzhou, which Marco described as the most noble city and the finest in the world, with a population that dwarfed any European city of his era. He returned to Venice in 1295, walking through his own front door after 24 years, so changed by time and sun that his own family did not immediately recognize him. The story goes that when they finally accepted who he was, he produced the dusty, travel-worn clothes he had arrived in and slit open the seams, and rubies and sapphires and emeralds and diamonds tumbled out onto the table. A few years later he was captured in a sea battle between Venice and Genoa and spent time in a Genoese prison, where he dictated his account of his travels to a fellow prisoner, a romance writer named Rustichello de Pisa. The resulting book, called The Description of the World, or Travels of Marco Polo, was copied and distributed across Europe and became one of the most widely read books of the medieval period. It described China, India, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf in detail that Europeans had never possessed. Christopher Columbus owned a copy and made extensive annotations in the margins. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he was partly trying to reach the lands Marco Polo had described, trying to find a sea route to the wealth of Cathay and Cipangu, China and Japan. The age of exploration, which reshaped the globe, was partly launched by a Venetian teenager's curiosity and a prison cell and a romance writer's ability to make a good story from a traveler's account. The Silk Road led Columbus to America. Or at least, Marco Polo's account of what lay at the Silk Road's eastern end did. Part 7. The End of the Road. The Silk Road did not end on a single day. It faded. It was replaced. The Mongol Empire, which had, for all its violence, created the safest conditions the overland road had ever operated under, began to fragment in the 14th century. The Pax Mongolica collapsed. The routes became more dangerous. The caravanserais fell into disrepair. Political fragmentation meant more borders, more tolls, more risk. And then came the Black Death. The plague that killed a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351 traveled the Silk Road. It originated in Central Asia, possibly in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, and moved west along trade routes, carried by fleas on the rats that infested every caravanserai and trading ship. It arrived in the Crimea in 1346, where Mongol forces besieging a Genoese trading post catapulted plague-infected bodies over the walls, one of the first documented uses of biological warfare. Genoese merchants fled by ship, carrying the plague to Constantinople, to Messina in Sicily, and from there across Europe. The plague devastated the trading networks that sustained the Silk Road. Cities were depopulated. Merchants died. The labor and the capital that sustained long-distance trade were consumed by disease and fear. And then came the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India in 1497 to 1499 opened a sea route that bypassed the entire overland Silk Road. Suddenly, European merchants could access Asian goods without the Ottoman tolls, the Central Asian dangers, the Pamir crossings. The sea route was cheaper, faster, and more reliable. Within decades, the great overland trading cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv, began to lose traffic. The world's center of commercial gravity shifted from the caravan routes to the ocean lanes. The Silk Road did not die entirely. Parts of it continued to function into the 19th century. But it ceased to be the spine of global trade. The world that had grown up along its length, the cosmopolitan, multilingual, multi-religious world of the caravanserai and the bazaar, began its long contraction. Part 8. Why it still matters. The Silk Road is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to the present. It is the prehistory of the present. Every religious tradition that shapes the modern world spread along its routes. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, all of them traveled roads that were also trade roads. The mathematical tools we use, decimal numerals, the concept of zero, algebra, traveled the road. The technologies that made the modern world, paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, traveled the road. The diseases that shaped human immunity, the bubonic plague, smallpox, measles, traveled the road, killing enormous numbers of people and in doing so creating the genetic inheritance of the survivors. And today, China is building something it calls the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project of railways, ports, pipelines, and roads connecting China to Europe and Africa through Central Asia and the Indian Ocean. It is explicitly modeled on and named for the historical Silk Road. The geopolitical ambitions and anxieties that surround it, questions about Chinese economic influence, about debt and dependency, about who controls the routes of global trade, are the same questions that surrounded the Silk Road for 2,000 years. The road never really ended. It transformed. The camel caravans became container ships. The caravanserais became port terminals. The Sogdian traders became multinational corporations. But the fundamental logic, that wealth and power flow along the routes of trade, and that whoever controls those routes shapes the world, that logic has not changed in 2,000 years. Closing. I want to end where we began, on the road itself. Not as a concept, as a physical place. Somewhere in the Taklamakan Desert, in the region of modern Xinjiang in western China, there are the ruins of cities that were swallowed by the sand. Naya, Lulan, Dandan Oilik. Cities that once sat on the branches of the Silk Road and thrived on its traffic and then, as rivers shifted and deserts expanded and trade routes moved, were simply abandoned. Left to the sand. For centuries they were lost. When archaeologists began excavating them in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found extraordinary things. Silk. Documents written in languages that had been dead for 1,000 years. Wooden artifacts, perfectly preserved by the dry air. The bodies of people, mummified by the desert, their features still visible, their clothing still colorful. These were ordinary people. Merchants. Farmers. Government officials. People who were born in those cities, grew up on the road's traffic, built their lives around the trade that passed through, and never imagined that their city would become a ruin under the sand and their bodies a discovery for a future they could not conceive of. That is the Silk Road. Not the romantic fantasy of exotic caravans and spices and silk. The real thing. People trying to make a living at the center of a world that was more connected than it knew and more fragile than it believed. The sand covered them. But what they carried, the paper, the ideas, the religions, the diseases, the technologies, that kept moving. West and east and west again. Into us. The road that connected the world never fully stopped connecting it. We are all, still, somewhere on the Silk Road. This has been Sarah History. Episode 6. Thank you for being here.